Welcome to a special episode of Doug's Electronic Repair Bench.
Afternoon, YouTube. Here with you this afternoon to bring you another in the series of the electronic troubleshooting. What I want to do today is kind of take a look, step back, and go back to the little basics of what we need to do before we actually get in there and start injecting signals, tracing signals, and things like that. There are various basic steps that you need to pay attention to before you actually begin your troubleshooting. That is your senses, your sight, your hearing, your sense of smell even. Those things will help you along your way to get a better idea of what you're looking at. Like I said, you plug it in. Does it make an acrid smell of some kind? Do you hear something, smell something burn? Do you see smoke? Do you feel heat coming off of components? Those things there are just basic things that you can do to maybe help you're on your way to fixing whatever's wrong with it. Some of the obvious things that you can do to help this along is, like I said, pay attention. I've mentioned this before, but pay attention to the previous owner of the equipment, and if he says this or that he thought was wrong with it, or whatever, it didn't do this or didn't do that, those are good places to start always. And it's just a good idea to use every trick that you can think of to help you to diagnose maybe what the problem is. So this, I want to give you an example of this receiver that I got from Terry, Pioneer SX3700. If we saw it when we first turned it on, and the first time I turned it on, it didn't actually do this. It worked fine the first time I turned it on, but I noticed when I did turn it on, and I really didn't pay a lot of attention to it at the time, but the FM didn't come on right away. And I switched it to FM, and it did come on, but there was a delay there, and I should have realized that there was a problem there if it delayed, because AM came on right away. And so that was one of the first things I should have noticed. And I did notice in the back of my head. I kept that in the back of my head, didn't say anything about it, and then the next time I turned it on, I noticed it took even longer for it to come on. And then by the third time I turned it on, when it was cold, it didn't come on at all for a long time until I let it warm up. And so those symptoms there were indications of a problem. And the problem more than likely was a bad solder joint at that time, because that was just, those symptoms are just characteristics of a bad solder joint. So then I started to use a little different method of going about to seeing if I could figure out what the problem was by tapping on top of the receiver, and lo and behold, that worked. I mean, I could tap on it and it would come right in. So that was another indication. Either now we're looking at either a bad solder joint or a bad connection somewhere, a loose wire or something like that. So it also indicated when I did this that there was changes in the display, and these are changes that you need to pay attention to when you're troubleshooting. And what I noticed was that the signal strength meter on the for the FM, when you tuned around there, it would change. It would go up and down and things like that. And so that meant that part up to the signal strength meter was working. I mean, obviously it was changing every time I tuned it. But then if you looked a little further, you noticed that the stereo light did not come on at all. no matter where I tuned it, and I knew I was tuning it to stations that were in stereo, and then I had gotten stereo where it was sitting at, and with the antenna that it was using. So those two clues, if you look at the block diagram, which I'm going to put up right here, you can see that there's two ICs there. One powers the signal strength meter, and the other one is a decoder for the stereo, and it powers the stereo light. So the problem has to be in that area right there between the two. So next step for me was to take the cover off and start my little screwdriver tapping, and which led to the fact that I found there's two boards in there that if you touch them just right, they would make it work or not work. So that again indicates to me bad connection or solder joint. So the logical next step will be to remove the bottom and start going in there and either applying heat or tapping or some method, or even just looking real close at the circuit board and see if we could see a bad solder joint or things like that. So that's just one place there where the stereo equipment or the equipment that you're testing will indicate what the problem is or where it's at, and that is very useful when troubleshooting, because if you can narrow that problem down to a certain area, and it makes it much easier to get in there and fix it. Now you can do the same thing with the signal injection that we just talked about. I could have applied the RF signal to the antenna area, or just even radiated it to the antenna with a tone, and then got in there with a signal tracer and started going through different components down the line until I lost the signal. That would be the same way of doing it, but with the stereo indicator and the signal strength indicator, that made it even easier, because I didn't even have to do that. It was right there, obvious where the problem was at. So another thing was the stereo was the tuner that Terry sent. I learned a good lesson there, because I was a little bit zealous in trying to trace down a problem when the problem was obviously in another area. If I would have been a little bit more observant, I would have saw it, but I was busy trying to trace down the signal path, and I just didn't notice it when it got to the AM switch, that the AM worked fine on both channels, and it had to go through that same switch. So that meant the problem couldn't be any further than that switch. So things like that, when you actually pay attention and notice them, will aid you greatly. I did finally see that. It took me an extra day to do it. It kind of registered in my brain that I needed to pay attention to that. So once I did, it was easy enough then to use the signal tracing and to trace down the actual bad component, which we did, and we got it fixed. So the other thing, another recent example was the ICO AM tuner that I looked at. The complaint from the eBay seller was that only part of the tubes lit up. And like I said again, you pay attention to what people tell you when they sell you something or give you a piece of equipment to work on. And so we did that, and sure enough, the only tube that lit up was the rectifier tube. And subsequent examination led to a bad power switch, and so that was a easy fix there as far as getting that working. So these things, what I'm trying to tell you, is basics on troubleshooting. You really need to pay attention to your sight, your sounds, your everything, that your smell, anything that you can use to aid in your troubleshooting quest to figure out what the problem is. So that is what we wanted to cover today, and it was pretty simple and basic. But I wanted to add this to the series because I think it's really important to do. Like I said, I think it's really important to have these basic skills in order to further your education and troubleshooting, whatever you want to call it. and your skills as a electronic technician to sniff out, and that's a word, believe it or not, sniff out your problems, and that's a good indication of what you get. Sniffing is a very good way. There's a lot of times you'll run into a problem that you turn on that receiver, whatever piece of equipment it is, and right away you'll smell something that's not normal. And that right there, number one, you should be paying attention if you've got it hooked up to a Variac or whatever, to the amperage draw and things like that, and her dim bulb. Is the dim bulb lit up real bright? If it's lit up real bright, then you've got a short somewhere, and that something's heating up, causing that smell. Those are the things that you really need to pay attention to when you start out troubleshooting anything. Is those senses, what you gather from your senses. You can use your finger if it's not high voltage to test the heat. You touch something, is it really hot? You can use a heat gun if you've got a heat gun, or not a heat gun, but a temperature gun to check the temperature. Those are good. But these basic things are things that you can use without actually doing the signal injection and signal tracing. They need to be adhered to also, and those are probably some of the most basic things that you can do. There are other things that you can do as well. Other things you may notice when you get a piece of equipment to work on is the fact that it's been modified. Those things are very are things to pay a lot of attention to, because you have no idea who modified it, if they knew what they were doing, anything like that. One of the comments I got on the receiver was that Terry had screwed just a regular screw into a buttonhole to make the phono button work. Well, I could see, you can see if you look at it, it's just screwed into plastic. It's not going to really affect anything, but there was a chance, and it was suggested that maybe the metal screw was contacting something inside that it wasn't supposed to contact. Well, that was a good, very good idea, but in this case I could see by looking in there that it's just screwed into a piece of plastic, and by knowing what the having the diagram and the the schematic and the service manual, I knew that there's just plastic behind there, and it really wasn't going to cause any problems like what we were having. So, like I said, that was one thing. But there are times when people modify something, and electronically or even physically to the case or to the chassis, and those modifications may cause other problems, and so you need to pay attention to that. In other words, like I said, my main goal in this segment of this troubleshooting series is to get you to pay attention to what you see, what you hear, what you smell, what you may touch. Is it hot? Is it cold? Those all indicate, could indicate a problem. They could indicate something normal. That's good to know too, though. So, I think that's really the only thing I wanted to get through to you on this kind of back to basic episode. Is to just pay attention to what the piece of equipment you're working on does when you plug it in, or even if it's just sitting there, you can observe it and see, like I said, with the modifications, you can see somebody, I took one look at the front of that, and I could see somebody had screwed a screw in. Well, Terry had told me he did that, and so I knew what he had done, and it was very easy, like I said, to look in there and see it's screwed into plastics, no problem. But if you have a piece of equipment like that, it comes in with something obviously that's been changed or something like that, unless you hear from them, even if you do hear from the previous owner that they did it and it worked fine afterwards, it's worth a little investigation to see for yourself if that is a problem or not. So I think that pretty much covers everything I wanted to cover this time. It's just I just wanted to get through to you guys that kind of was expecting more on this troubleshooting series. I mean, I've gotten away from it. I've gotten away from a lot of things, but I wanted to get back to it today to just sort of go over these basic things that we need to pay attention to as troubleshooters, electronic troubleshooters, and we can learn a lot by just listening to our senses. So, you guys have a great day. Thanks so much for watching. See ya.